I've got these brackets I'm welding onto the chassis. And I've got a whole bunch of other things to talk about that I want to go over. Lots of planning. Some of it's tough to figure out. I don't do this all the time. When you're doing something this custom, there's a lot of things to consider. We'll go over that in a minute. Well, the reason for my blanket here, I want to make sure I didn't burn the paint off of my shiny rear end, and I've got a gas tank that I'm trying to figure out. I've got brake lines I'm trying to figure out. I've got e-brakes. I've got drive line. I've got exhaust. What I'm trying to do is get everything done on this chassis so that it is completely rolling, drive line, exhaust, everything ready to go. I could literally fire this thing up, arrange a seat, and drive it. That's my plan. Chassis completely done, and then I can get to work on the body, and then it's just a matter of dropping the body out of the chassis. I'm probably not going to do all the body work on the body. Mainly I'm going to concentrate on all the underside of that body, so that when I set it on here, I can finish the body work while it's sitting on the chassis. And I could even paint it while it's sitting on the chassis. That way it's just so much easier to be able to move it around the shop and not have two separate pieces. But for now, if I could just get all of this done, I can roll it into the back and I can tarp it all up, and then I can strip everything off the underside of that chassis and get it ready to paint too. So with all of that, I'm getting really close to planning out everything, and that's what these brackets are for. The only thing that I have left on this rear end is how to tie it to the chassis and what kind of springs to use and what kind of shocks to use. So once I finally found those pieces, then I was able to rig up these brackets for those coil over shocks. And I'll show you that here in just a second. So as part of all of this 4-link suspension kit, where the lower link bars connect, there's a bracket on the back for a shock. And the shock mount, then there are several ways you can attach this. Most of the hot rodders will run a bar across and a bracket, and this mounts to that bar. Since this was already in place on the Willys, it's plenty strong enough to use for my shocks. I just needed a way of mounting it. So what I did is I put on a 3/16 1/4-inch thick steel plate that I welded to this. Welded it to the frame as well as to this crossmember piece. This crossmember piece is fairly heavy metal. If I was to just weld this or run a bolt through it, it's not quite heavy enough. So that's why I went with the heavier stock. Leveled it up on both sides. I ended up doing this on a slight angle. So the shocks are on an angle on both sides. And the reason why I ended up doing that is the bracket, the base of the axle, is slightly under the chassis. So if I just ran these straight up and down, the spring would rub here. I don't know what the rule is on how much you can lean these shocks, but I saw it a lot with hot rods. They'll tilt these in a little bit. It actually gives you a little more stability in turns for the forces. So there's good reasons for it. But if you go too far, then they kind of lose their ability to support the vehicle. So, don't know exactly how it works, but I feel very comfortable with my decision here. And these brackets that I ended up using, it's just a matter of getting it offset far enough so that the spring doesn't rub on this side as well. So rear end wise, everything is now complete. All the suspension is complete, the springs. These coilover springs are fully adjustable, as well as the rear end bracket has 3 positions it can actually mount to. So with this down all the way without any weight on it, I'm about 1 inch, 2 inches higher than I want. So by the time I add the fuel tank and fill it with fuel, put the body on, put occupants in it, I'm thinking this will probably settle 2 or 3 inches. Might end up being a little bit too low. I can bring up some of the height in the springs adjustment as well as the rear end adjustment. Now let's say it just doesn't sag. These springs are 250-pound resistance springs. I don't know anything about springs. I had to do a lot of research. There's some calculations you can do. With a 2-seat Roadster, I was reading a 200-pound spring is pretty much adequate. With a Phaeton, couldn't find anything. Now with a 2-door sedan, Model A, 32 sedan, they recommended going with a 250 to 300. You get occupants in it, you've got that extra body. So I split it with a Roadster, a Phaeton, convertible top. The weight of this body is going to be less than a sedan. A lot of the Ford sedans, the Model A's, early 30s, they had a lot of wood, a lot of extra weight in them. So I'm hoping these springs will work for me. If by chance it ends up being too low, these springs can be adjusted in tension and I can actually bring the rear end back up. So I think I've got a good blend. These springs are not that expensive. If they're too heavy and I end up having to drop a spring, they're $100 for a pair of springs. So I think this is a really good mate for this car. And say this is all done. Now I need to worry about brakes. The way this suspension was set up for the Mustang, he didn't have disc brakes that could be controlled with an e-brake, an emergency brake. So that had to change. I can't have a Roadster without an emergency brake. So I changed the calipers. I put GM calipers on it with emergency brake levers. And the emergency brake originally for the Willys would have converted over to this. But the Willys parts are rusty. Yeah, I can sandblast them off. I can fix them up. I could make the Willys cables work on this. But for the amount of work, the front suspension I bought from Classic Performance Products. They do fantastic suspension. So I got in touch with them and they have a universal e-brake setup that is set up for the GM rear brakes. And the cables come way long, but you can cut them down to suit. And that then all hooks up fairly simple. So then it was just a matter, okay, how do I route it? I need to route it right over towards the side of the transmission. So that works out to where if I follow this lower link, there's a bracket here that the old one was on. So I will be able to mount this one the same way. I'll be cutting it off about here. The cable will come out and I'll fasten the cable to either the handbrake that was under the dash, which is kind of cool, or an e-brake on the center console next to the stick shift. We'll see. That's something I don't have to really worry about. The main thing was, how am I going to hook this up and make it work? So there's a clamp system here, which is the original Willys. Perfect fitment, perfect bracket, works just fine. This was $70 for a pair, so that's great. So once I have that figured out now, that will go here. So then I'm looking at the brake lines for the actual brakes. And I was going to bend my own lines and put it along the top, similar to what most of the manufacturers do. This kit actually came with this rear end. When the guy bought these disc brakes for his Mustang, it came with these lines. I wasn't going to use them. I was going to just go ahead and bend my own lines. But the problem with disc brakes and the way the caliper works, it has a lot of flex and movement. As it adjusts, you don't really want to be doing that with hard lines. So I want to keep a soft line. These are really nice braided lines. Then I was trying to figure out, okay, how am I going to attach it to the rear end? How do I attach it here? I have to have this line attached where it attaches to the body. These hoses are so long, I decided I'm going to run it along the e-brake, and then I'll put hard lines down the sides of the chassis to connect up the brakes. Since both of these lines are going to be flexing with the rear end, they're intended to. I think it's a perfect fit. There's a bump stop that goes here, so if the rear end bottoms out, it hits that stop so that the tire doesn't rub on the fender and all those possibilities. So I don't want these brake lines getting smashed in the bump stop. It's not very likely, but you never know. That's what the bump stop's for. So those will have to be ran just inside, or I should say to the outside of the chassis, and then come underneath and go to that bracket. So that was stressful trying to figure out how I was going to do all that, and it just fell together. So that's exciting. So brakes are figured out now. Fuel lines, fuel tank. The fuel tank, this tank is an 18-gallon tank that is actually built for a 54 Chevy. The original gas tank for this Jeepster, I believe, is a 15-gallon tank. It's not set up for fuel injection. So for me to change that over to fuel injection, it made more sense to just see if I could find another tank that was similar in size and hopefully store more gas that would have all the pieces readily available for the fuel injection system. So the nice thing about this kit, not only does it have the same fill area for filling the gas tank, but it came with an in-tank pump and filter system. It comes with the fuel gauge sending unit, and it has an exterior regulator that mounts here on the back that regulates the perfect amount of pressure to go to the engine for the injection system. They run about 58 psi. This particular Phytech system, that's what it uses. So it's just a perfect match. And how much I spent on the complete kit for this, I probably saved a couple $100 in doing it all that way. So this then, I need to figure out how to mount it. Well, one of the things about this tank system and the full kit is they recommend going with 3/8 inch flex line hoses, high pressure hose that is made specifically for the modern fuels. And at 58 psi, the steel lines are nice, but a lot of the connectors aren't ideal. So since this came with all that hose, I'm not having to worry about bending lines and drilling holes and figuring out where to put all of that. Yeah, I'll probably end up drilling holes for the little clips on where I'm going to support this flex hose all the way down the side of the frame, but that's not going to really affect my paint job on this frame. So other than where this tank physically goes, it doesn't actually mount to the chassis. I thought about mounting to the chassis, but the original tank was mounted to the underside of the body. And the way this filler neck and everything goes, it's really going to be easier to do under the body and make this part of the body instead of part of the chassis. So I've made that decision now too. Gas tank, I don't have to worry about it at this point. Fuel lines, don't have to worry about. The brake cable, the brake lines, looks like that's going to be pretty simple. Probably only take me about an hour. Another hour bending all the lines. I'll bend lines. I've got little brackets that clip it all onto the chassis. So really the only thing I've got left is the transmission mount. Where that transmission mount mounts to this chassis, everything is done except I just need to drill 2 holes. And that plate is, it's like a 1/2 inch thick plate that I've got to drill through. So I'll mark that. I've got to flip this chassis back over again, upside down, drill those holes, get that transmission mount all set up. I need to weld the bottom side of these plates. I couldn't quite get there. I'm dripping molten metal on me. So to get a good solid weld on this, speaking of welds, when welding plate like this to a chassis, when I weld it on the front brackets to the full front suspension, if I just ran a bead of weld up this chassis, you run the risk of this chassis, this frame rail cracking. With any movement, vibration, a solid weld is not a good idea. Anytime you're welding on a frame, stitch weld. Leave some gaps. Keep that original metal from getting too hot and then too cold and cycling and weakening that. So I only ran about 1 inch of weld on the actual frame itself. Across the top here, no issues. I ran a full bead across the top. This bottom piece, the same way. I'll run a full bead under the bottom. This area right here, I just stitched it again. A little weld here, a little weld here. I don't want it to be cracking vertically. Horizontally, I've got plenty of surface area here. I've got plenty of original metal. I'm not at all concerned about damaging the integrity of that metal. And I got a beautiful weld. Oh, the only thing I've got left now is the exhaust. And I started playing around with the exhaust. I got really excited and my plans kind of fell apart. So I got a new plan now that I'm excited about, and I'll show you that. The original headers that were on the Mustang, they were a stainless steel header. They were okay. They weren't the best header. But the guy took a hammer to them and just beat the crap out of them in order to get them to fit on that Mustang. So they're gone, and I started shopping for a nice set of headers. This set that I ended up getting, this is actually the 3rd set. You can see a very nice stainless steel chrome look, and it has a 2.5 inch collector. When I found these, I was so excited. I put in an order and they were on back order forever. I waited for months. I finally gave up and thought, well, I'm just going to have to find something else. I finally ended up finding a set in stock that was the exact header. This header is made for hot rods. This is made for putting together the 30s type of chassis. So it's perfect for what I'm doing. I bought a set. They shipped it. I had it in 3 days. I was all excited. I pulled it out of the box. It wasn't coated. It was raw steel. So I mounted everything up, and I was able to really play around with it and realize, okay, these are going to be the absolute perfect set of headers for my clutch system, for the starter, for the way my motor mounts are, and the exhaust that I want to do. So I got a hold of the guys and said, hey, do you have a ceramic set? I bought a ceramic set. You shipped me a raw set. The guy was great to work with. He apologized. He got me another set out. I had them within a couple of days. They mount beautifully. Everything's perfect. And I have the 2.5 inch collector for my exhaust. So exhaust wise, those headers hang almost perfect where I want them. They're just a little bit low, but they're far enough off the ground that they're at the same height as my cross member on my front end. So my front end is going to be about 5 inches off the ground. My collectors are about 5 inches off the ground, so I'm happy with that. But my pipe, I need to get up to come through the center of the chassis. So it's just a matter of using elbows like this where I can angle it. I'll be able to kick it up, kick it through. It comes through this area of the chassis. The opening is the perfect size to run next to my transmission mount. There's plenty of room so it's not going to rattle. I'll be able to weld a bracket on here. So that will stay where it's supposed to. I got me some Flowmaster mufflers. These are a nice mid-tone sound race muffler. They're full of fiberglass. It's not just a hollow chamber. Hollow chambers are nice. I had them on my Buick, but they drone. They're a little deeper of a tone than what I wanted. So when I saw these, they're a lot like the old cherry bombs, where it's a chamber straight through with holes in fiberglass. It's what the guy had on the Mustang too. Had a great sound. So I went with those. These are bigger than the cherry bombs, so it'll deaden the sound even more. It's going to fit in here perfectly. Then pipe goes straight out the back, and that's what I started doing with this, was how this kicks up and around and up and over. So the kit has 4 180-degree bends, it has 4 90s, and it has 4 of these 45s. So with all of that, should give me plenty of pieces that I can build my own. I can weld all the joints. There'll be 2 places where it'll be clamped on. I want to clamp on the muffler so that I can get it out if I have to. This piece will be one piece, so it'll all be welded together. Where it comes out here, it'll be clamped on here until it gets to the rear end, and there'll be another clamp there so I can go up and over the rear end and out the back. So 4 clamps on each side, maybe 3, probably 3. And then I will weld on hangers, so it'll all be solid, bolted to the frame. I'm excited. It's just a matter of now that I have my headers, then I can work from the headers back and build my mounts, weld on my brackets, weld all these sections together. I want it black. I want the mufflers black. I want all the exhaust black. And then I'll keep my nice shiny headers. And then I've got some accessories that'll be going on this engine that I'm really excited about too, that will tie in all this silver and black together. Because when I build this exhaust, I want it to be semi-permanent. I'll do it all before the chassis is painted, but I want these headers mounted permanently to the motor. So before I do that, I gotta get rid of this ugly blue. It looks great in a Ford Mustang, but it's not going to look good in the engine compartment of my Willys. So I want to paint this engine black. I'm going to keep the silver Edelbrock heads, keep the exhaust, but everything else will be painted black, even my intake manifold. There we go. There's my plan. I got a lot of work cut out for me, but it's really exciting. This is finally all coming together. I've got all the pieces now to do the chassis. I just need to spend the time on finishing it. There's only just light surface rust on this chassis, so that's going to be really easy to clean up and get the chassis all painted. I've got to flip it over, drill some holes, do a couple more welds, sand it all down, and chassis done. It's pretty exciting. So stay tuned. I'll just keep plugging away little by little, and I'll get you some updated videos as it comes along. Appreciate you watching. Goodbye for now.